Welcome to Day 5 of Unit 6, The Arts. Our topic today is what makes something art, considering the role of art and technology. Under old business, I hope that by now you've completed your human sciences assessment. I think you've been given ample time to do this complex assignment. I know it's asked for more than past ones, but we've had a couple weeks and we've done it step by step. And of course, the last unit assessment, I think, of this year comes next class. Another reason to get it done now. Some of you have yet to turn in any of the assessments. And, just be clear, you won't get credit for this semester of TOK if you don't take care of these academic responsibilities. I'm not going to sign off on it until I've read all 3 assessments. So, as Spike Lee would say, do the right thing. All right, new business. Today we have the last lesson in the arts, and I think it's going to be kind of a fun one. I'm going to be talking to you for about 10, 15 minutes, and then you're going to watch a video that it's a documentary, but I think you're going to find it really interesting. All right, so part of what we're going to talk about today is the future of the arts. We're going to begin with our checklist. Here's what I hope you will know and be able to articulate by the end of the day. By the end of the day's class, you should be able to articulate why art might not be the sole domain of human consciousness. In other words, maybe you don't need human consciousness to create art. You should be able to explain how technology challenges our very notion of what creativity means, and you should understand why technology raises interesting issues in the creation of art. All right, so here's where we're going to start. We're going to start by looking at, from the last class and the class before that too, what the author of your textbook, Dombrowski, puts forth as the criterion for genuine art. She says genuine art creates something accessible to the senses. It aims to deliberately shape human experience with the materials it chooses. Typo there. With the material it chooses, it can communicate something to its audience, a purpose set within a perspective. It uses all the powers of subjectivity, imagination, creativity, and aesthetic judgment, as well as our capacity to communicate. Now, I think most people would find this a reasonable list of requirements for art, but there's one of these criteria that the article that you read for today calls into question. The article was that, will the next Picasso be a robot? And that's this one. The criterion that it uses all of the powers of subjectivity, imagination, creativity, and aesthetic judgment, as well as our capacity to communicate. Well, if artificial intelligence can create art, well, clearly then we're not using human powers of imagination, creativity, and aesthetic judgment. So we ask, does art need a person with their powers of creativity, imagination, and artistic sensibility if a non-human can fill the other requirements? Okay, so the first thing we're going to do to find out, let's review the article for today. Will the next Picasso be a robot? The first point is how this art AI, or art in artificial intelligence, works. In other words, the way this program that was being described in the article works is there are 2 loops. There's a creating loop and a judging loop, and feedback from them is what finally results in the work of art. Now, one thing we would say, it's not completely generated by a computer because presumably expert opinion has been fed into the feedback loop. And noted that they use 81,000 pieces of art from the 15th century, from the Renaissance basically to the modern world, from WikiArt. So clearly there was at least some initial human input. But the result is that the creating loop tries to generate things, and what they try to do is they generate things that are at the very limits of the rules imposed by the judging loop. So the idea is, the implication here is maybe there's a formula for creativity, and it's coloring just inside the lines. If we use the metaphor of, a coloring book and lines as being the limits of where you're allowed to color. So it seems in this idea, the creative pieces it comes up with is they just test the very boundaries of the rules that have been imposed. Now, if that's true, then perhaps human consciousness is not required for creativity. And this is reinforced by the fact that the article points out that people seem to actually prefer the computer-generated art. And there's another interesting question here, one that suggests that perhaps the machine artist is not completely removed from human consciousness. So, in other words, we have this question that perhaps creativity is not a completely human domain, but we can't ignore that in setting up this AI, there still has been some human consciousness input. So what about the themes of art? Its desire to deliberately shape experience. Well, one of the questions I had was, is it possible that in modeling its judgments, misspelled, on the 81,000 entries from WikiArts, that the machine is just copying? If every one of those 81,000 works of art has a conscious human creative impulse, well, could it be that they're just borrowing that human impulse and incorporating into their art, which would mean that they're not really creating new ideas, they're just recycling human ideas? Now, you can say that, and that kind of diminishes the possible effect of artificial intelligence as being a purely creative activity. But then again, you have to say the same requirement or the same limitation can be imposed on artists. Of course, to some degree, the same could be said of human artists. They don't work in a vacuum and they draw on past works. So I'm not sure how valid that criticism is. So could machines create new movements that challenge existing paradigms could a machine come up with the next big thing in art, just like human artists came up with Impressionism, Dadaism, which I don't really get, and not realism, surrealism? That's the question. And then another question is, could then creativity just be a certain type of defined variation? There's when we're being creative, we're operating within rules, but we find new ways of using those rules. Is that what creativity is? Because if it is, then that might be something that a machine learning language could do. So could creativity then be a certain type of defined variation, that is, varying something enough that it stretches the boundaries of art without being outside of the arts completely? Well, that should bring up a whole host of knowledge questions, like I got to get a better typist. To what extent is or should art be considered a human enterprise? Is it possible to define the nature of creativity in the arts? What is the relationship between technology and art? To what extent is intentionality or purpose a guiding feature in the creation of arts? These are all questions that this new introduction of technology brings up, and maybe something you would want to investigate when you are writing on this subject, whether it's on the presentation or on the assessment or whether it's on the TOK essay. Now, other issues in art before we get to the documentary. The article we read seems to challenge some of the assumptions about genuine art and its status as a purely human creation. Now, I have some experience with this, and I'm going to tell you a little story. I call it the story of Horace publishes a poem. It's not going to be in the notes because it would take too long to type out, but I'm going to tell you about it here. So when I was an undergraduate way back in the previous century, 1974, my advisor, I was a philosophy major, my advisor, Dr. Jim Sheridan, had an activity. He bought there used to be a company called Radio Shack where people could DIY, do it yourself, and you could build or buy, in his case, buy a simple computer. So he bought this computer. He called it Horace after, Horace, the Roman poet who wrote the Odes. And now Horace was tiny. For example, most of your phones have 64 gigabytes of memory. Horace had 64K. So it was a tiny little thing. But what he did is he took a year and he started plugging in the kind of descriptors that poetry uses. And then he would have Horace spit out some poetry. Then we'd take it to a technologically minded English teacher and show him the stuff. And he would tell them what seemed to be like poetry and what didn't seem to be like poetry. And then Dr. Sheridan would program in new rules and new guidelines. And day and night for a year, Horace would spit out poems. They were sonnets because you had to do something that was very short, like Petrarchian sonnets. And then he would take them all to Dr. Kern, and Dr. Kern would, some of them just made no sense, and kind of like freshman essays, and he would throw them out. But some of them, even though this was just a purely random generation, were pretty good. At the end of 2 years, they put together, out of the thousands and thousands of sonnets, they put together ones that really made sense, sent it to an English publisher, and Horace published a slim volume of poetry. And of course, this just raised Cain in the academic world, and particularly in the Allegheny College English department, the idea that a computer with no consciousness and no real understanding or of the creative urge, the muse of poetry, would be able to randomly generate poems. So long before this Picasso thing, I'd had an experience with this, and I've always been kind of fascinated with, to what degree can we explain a process of creativity? So what both the article and the story have in common is that they seem to argue creativity is a process that might be seen, at least to some degree, as some sort of mechanical variation and not uniquely human. So we want to close our study of the arts by looking at a related issue. So thus far, we've looked at this idea of can technology show us something about creativity that we didn't understand before? And if it does that mean humans aren't the only entities capable of being creative? And then the second one is also a technological thing. If a work of art can be reproduced by a purely mechanical means, in other words, if there's a mechanical means that I could show you where you could reproduce the work of, say, a great master, would that art still be considered a masterpiece? Well, this is the question taken up in the video, the documentary that you're going to spend the rest of the period looking at. It's called Tim's Vermeer. I think it came out in about 2003. So first of all, Tim's Vermeer is the study of this famous Dutch artist Vermeer. So here I stole this right from Wikipedia. Johan Vermeer, born in October 1623 in Delft. Delft is a small island in the Netherlands, and died in 1675. He was known as Jan Vermeer van Delft from Delft. He was a Dutch Baroque painter who specialized in domestic interior scenes of the middle class. During his lifetime, he was a moderately successful genre painter, recognized in Delft and in The Hague. The Hague is the area around just south of Amsterdam. Nevertheless, he produced relatively few paintings and evidently was not wealthy, leaving his wife and children in debt at his death. Vermeer worked very slowly with great care and frequently used very expensive pigments. Now, this is the important part. He particularly is renowned for his masterly treatment and use of light. However, Vermeer became very popular, as many artists, think of Van Gogh. Remember, Van Gogh never sold he sold one painting during his life. His brother Theo was an art dealer, and he begged someone to buy one of Vincent's works. Another clear case of discriminating against red-haired people. All right. And he's become popular once again. There was a movie you're probably too young to know, but it was very famous at the time. In 2003, Scarlett Johansson starred in this movie called The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which was also a very popular book. And so Vermeer is one of these Dutch master painters. And then in the very entertaining documentary that you're about to watch, a technologically minded inventor argues that he believes Vermeer used a piece of equipment that allowed him to accurately and mechanically produce what he saw. Mechanically produce means you don't have to have any special talent, that if you follow the guidelines for using this equipment, anyone would be able to produce the same results. And of course, if this is true, and this is the whole quest of the documentary, the question becomes, if this is true, should Vermeer be considered one of the great masters of Dutch art? So if you think that using this technique that in theory anyone could use is cheating, then the answer would be no, then Vermeer was not an artist. Now, you may make the argument that even though he used the mechanical means, he's still an artist because, he set up the scenes. He had the creative impulse that makes the scenes compelling, even though he didn't have to have any special skills to create those scenes. Okay. Whether that is, however, bear in mind that machines also seem to be able to create meaningful scenes, whether that is because they simply borrow the intent of the works they're based upon. That's always an open question. But basically, I just want you to enjoy this documentary. I want you to sit back and enjoy the film. And at the end, think again. I think you've had enough study sheets for a while. I just want you to think again about what is the relationship between art and technology. What do you think about the idea that only conscious beings can create art? And finally, if art doesn't require specialized skills, should it still be considered art? So I'm going to ask you now to watch Tim's Vermeer. So I'm going to put that in red. But before we do this, let's just review our checklist. Again, by the end of today's class, you should be able to articulate why art might not be the sole domain of human consciousness. You should be able to explain how technology challenges our notions of creativity, and you should understand why technology raises interesting issues in the creation of art. All right. Well, that just about wraps it up for now. Looking at my calendar here, we are now on the 4th of May, and our next class is Wednesday, the 6th, and that's going to be, we're going to have a video conference that day where we are going to talk about the assessment, and I will try to make a screencast that will be released at 4 o'clock on the day of this screencast that tells you what we're going through, so you'll be able to answer questions. Okay, so we're getting near the end. I love that old joke, sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel is the headlight of an oncoming train. I hope that's not the case now. We're in our first week of May, and I think we're going to do some kind of interesting, fun stuff after we finish this assessment. All right, well, be safe, be well, and I will see your shining faces and talk with you on Wednesday.